Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about digital inclusion grant strategies and collaborative partnerships. Before we get into it, want to go over just a few quick housekeeping items. As an attendee, your video and mic are disabled. So you will be able to see and hear me as well as the panelists, but we won't be able to see or hear you. So the best way to participate is to drop your questions in the Q&A chat throughout the webinar, and we'll be collecting them, and we'll do our best to get to them all in our dedicated Q&A session towards the end. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so we will be able to send out the link to the recording sometime today or tomorrow. And so if you're not able to stay for the whole session, that's okay. You'll have access to the recording. So I want to give a quick refresher on the Digital Equity Act programs and just a high-level overview of the funding timelines for them. Oops. So the state Digital Equity Planning Grant Program, that was a grant program administered to states to help them create their digital equity plans. So they have all submitted their plans to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That's the agency that is going to oversee these grant programs. So now we're in this next phase, which is the second bucket of funding, the State Capacity Grant Program. So this funding is going to be administered to states to help them actually implement the plans that they created. And with the capacity grant program, states will be able, if they choose to make subawards to eligible organizations and entities in the state to help with the implementation activities of the digital equity plan. So that funding window is open. We go into it in great detail. We break that down in a blog post that will drop the link to that in the chat. It was also the subject of the webinar that we hosted this past Friday. So if you are interested in learning about how to position your organizations to support states in the implementation process through a subaward, I'd highly recommend you give that blog post a read and look at the recording of the webinar that we hosted. This last bucket of funding here at the bottom, the competitive grant program, will be an opportunity for eligible organizations in the states to apply directly to NTIA for funding. So unlike these first two grant programs, organizations can apply directly to NTIA for it. That application window we expect will open sometime very late this summer. So it's not open yet. So in the webinar today, we won't be talking about the application process for the competitive grants, but we did want to bring you in to a conversation to encourage some thinking about building good partnerships to submit a strong application to NTIA once the application window does open. So why do partnerships matter? Well, in the context of this grant program, we don't know yet when Congress will make another really big investment in digital equity like they have here. So it's going to be really important that these funds are distributed really efficiently to maximize the investment. So want to bring you all along with us to talk more about collaborative partnerships. I have really great panelists with us today. I have Bill Callahan, the Director of Connect Your Community, Maggie Drummond-Ball, the Director of Strategic Partnerships with Maine Connectivity Authority, and Samantha Shartman, the Director of Philanthropic Programs at Connect Humanity. And I am Sion Tesfaye, Senior Manager here at NDIA, and I'll be moderating our session today. Bill, I'll start with you. Can you talk to us about the grant program that you worked under and the partnerships that you built and what the scope of the project you worked with was?
Sure. Thanks, Sion. And thanks everybody for coming. I see there are about 160 attendees, which is great. Um, so I know most of the folks on the call to the extent that we do know people through NDIA and through my role in the organization during its first 5 years. Prior to that, though, and after that, I work in the Cleveland area. And there was an earlier NTIA program, which in some ways may end up being a bit of a model for the DEA competitive grant project, for which I served as project director. It happened between 2009 and 2013, and it was actually the first Connect Your Community. It was the first use of the name. So this was funded under something called the Sustainable Broadband Adoption Program of the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, which was an Obama stimulus funded program run by NTIA. The particular office that ran this part of the program was run by Laura Breeden, who the former chair of NTIA, many people probably know. And it had $250 million to spend over the course of 3 years. Now, that's about a fifth of what the competitive grant program is going to have to spend. So much smaller scale, but many of the grants were probably in the same ballpark as ones which are going to be applied for in the next year. So in some ways, it's a model. More to the point, it's the same office. In many ways, it'll have the same compliance requirements. Those federal compliance requirements don't really change in the contracting process. And it may or may not have some of the same goals. The goal of the Sustainable Broadband Adoption project from 2009 forward was exactly what it sounds like. Nobody was at that point talking about digital inclusion. That was a term that became popular late in that process. But broadband adoption was very much on the minds of the program. This actually, interestingly, it was associated with a much bigger infrastructure program, right? So some things don't change. And the goal was to have quantifiable, documented cases of people who were not connected, low-income families that were not connected, becoming connected, and becoming connected in a way that they could then continue to be after the program had moved on. So in some ways, it was very simple. You had to propose to NTIA some method by which you were going to cause that to happen, right? And quantify it. I was working at the time for something called One Community. It doesn't exist anymore, but its child is Digital C in Cleveland. And One Community was mostly a middle mile infrastructure program. But at the point at which this program came along, it had a partnership with the Knight Foundation, and that partnership included a much broader kind of community technology or community network planning process that included digital inclusion. And I was actually on staff working on that. So in that role, I was working with some groups in Detroit and other places. Prior to that, I also had a lot of relationships in Cleveland, as did other people at One Community because it was based there. So when the notice of funding opportunity came out, or before it came out, obviously people were talking about that possibility, and we started a process of discussion among partners in Detroit, partners in Cleveland, partners in Akron, which was very much part of the Knight network, and partners in some other places which had Knight Foundation offices because they were former Knight newspaper communities. And over the 4 months that, and this is question 2, but I'm going to, and so I'm going to skip to it pretty quickly. But over the course of 4 months, we put together a project which ended up, when it got through the whole meat grinder, of being about $18.5 million to fund 15 not-for-profit partners in 8 localities to take on creating those sustainable broadband adoption cases in all those communities to the tune of 30,000 people proposed participating in training, and about 23,000 people actually having moved from non-connection to adoption in some documentable way. And those targets were divvied up among all those partners, as was the money. So that was the CYC project. As I say, I was project director. Sam Sharpman, who's going to speak later, was the assistant director and basically did all the training and evaluation work. I guess I'll close by saying that we spent the money, we met our goals, and all of the partners who came in had not been partners prior and were not really partners afterward. So the project was really stood up for the purpose of doing it. And while obviously many of the partners were engaged in this work and continued to be engaged in this work, it did not create a permanent structure. So that's pretty much the story, and I guess we'll tell more of it later.
Thank you, Bill. So Maggie, you worked with a different federal grant, one that is a little more recent. One people might be a little more familiar with, but could you tell us a little bit about the grant you were awarded and sort of the scope of the project and what your goals were?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Nice to be with you all. And I'm realizing that as Bill was finishing talking, I should also just say that we're sort of coming to this conversation both with a smaller scale effort and also coming from the Maine Connectivity Authority. We're coming to this conversation with the perspective both as a grantee of NTIA and funding a network of our partners in Maine, but also as a funder and both actively implementing programs where we are funding networks of partners working together and thinking about how we will do this successfully in the future through the state capacity funding. So I will bring a little bit of that lens to this conversation today and hope that will be helpful. I wanted to share just a little bit about what we call our Regional and Tribal Broadband Partners Program. And this is a program that we founded at the end of 2022 as an effort to sort of build capacity for our partners around the state who could continue to do engagement and outreach and provide support around both broadband infrastructure planning and digital inclusion and digital equity efforts that we knew would be really kicking into high gear in 2023 as we ramped up to create the digital equity plan for the state of Maine. And I'll share a slide just to give you a bit of a visual on what this program looked like. We created this initially as a 2-year program and used our state recovery funds, ARPA funds, to fund these partners. The goal was really to find a partner to support every geographic region of the state and to provide support and capacity to our tribal nations as well. So that's why we called it the Regional and Tribal Partners Program. We funded this program with $3 million a year. We supported the partners with a maximum funding of $250,000 per partner. And we really saw the capacity in building this network of partners as a way to support our digital equity planning that would start the next year. The sort of deliverables or things that these partners needed to be able to do were really working together monthly. We treated this as a cohort based program. So we were all together with monthly meetings, and we also convened with a larger statewide network of our agency partners and nonprofit partners, which we called the Digital Equity Task Force. So we're really trying to support and engage an ecosystem as a whole across the state. These regional and tribal partners were some of them working together in a sort of more informal, not formally funded coalition and network prior to starting this program. So this was the first time as we launched this program that we actually had funding to support capacity for these organizations. They were charged with supporting their local communities across the regions. And I've highlighted here, the really significant thing we needed them to do was develop these digital equity coalitions within their regions. So that was part of the mindset going in. We were looking for partners that could convene a broad set of stakeholders and partners within their regions that were very close to the covered populations, already in relationship, already providing services, or representative of and led by those covered populations. So that was a really significant part of the program. And then we really needed these partners to be participating with us in the development of our digital equity plans. So helping to gather the data that we needed to create the plan, to inform the plan. We worked together to do surveys and community meetings and focus groups throughout our engagement process. And each of these regional and tribal partners created a regional or tribal digital equity plan. So those all were contributing components of our state digital equity plan. And then, of course, participated in what was really the cap of our digital equity planning process, which was the digital equity workshop. So this network of partners has been a significant part of our work across the state of Maine, and they're sort of a network of ours, but they created their own networks beyond that. And there's more to learn from the ways that they structured their partnerships and distributed funding there as well, which I know we'll talk about more.
Thanks, Maggie. Want to go a little bit deeper and talk about the selection process for the partners or sub-awardees. So, there's lots of things to consider in building partnerships. Maggie, you touched on one, which is, working with organizations that were really close to the people that they served, how well they're connected to those communities. And, there's also their capacity to deliver on the program goals. Bill, I'm going to bring it back to you for this, just to speak more broadly. I know you touched a little bit on this, on some aspects of this already, but can you walk us through briefly the process of, the selection of the partners, sort of in the prelude to submitting that application to NTIA for the award?
Sure. Can you stick that slide back up?
Of course. Yeah. Give me just a second.
Okay. Well, while Sion's grabbing it, people may remember the slide that we had up a couple of minutes ago when I was talking. Here we go. Okay. So I ran right through this real quick, but let me take it in a slight. I have a little bit more time to do this, so I'm taking it a little slightly more relaxed way. One community, which was the organizer of this project and for which I worked, had a relationship with the Knight Foundation, which was interested in promoting successful proposals to Knight as well as other places from a number of communities where it has a long time investment. Detroit was one of those. Akron was one of those. There's a number of others that I'll talk about in a second. Lexington, Kentucky, Bradenton, Florida, Winston-Salem, so on. So they saw the possibility of grants from the BTOP program as an element of that, as of course we did. And so there was a discussion early on when it became clear that was going to be part of the Obama stimulus plan. And probably 4 months out from the notice of funding opportunity, we kind of settled on the idea that we wanted to make the case through a project that you could scale up a very normal personal, hands-on, community-based broadband adoption strategy, which many organizations were doing at a small scale. You could scale it up very successfully and accountably, and it was simply a matter of throwing enough money at the problem, right? That's effectively, or we talked about it that way. By throwing enough money at the problem, we meant employing enough people to work in communities to be able to do the things we knew how to do on a larger scale. And those things were, the digital inclusion legs of the stool: training, equipment, connectivity, support, right? That's, we didn't have the stool in our proposal, but we had all the rest of it. So it was a simple proposition, and what we were looking for was a large enough and diverse enough group of partners to make that case persuadably and to interest NTIA, and also to reflect a number of different kinds of communities in which we knew low-income consumers were likely to be on the outside looking in. So that's basically what we have here. The recruitment process was partly talking to all the people in night communities who might have an interest. As I said earlier, I was working with groups in Detroit. They were among the first people in the discussion. So that was one piece of the puzzle. Another piece was groups who'd been working together for the previous 10 years in Cleveland. A third piece developed from people who weren't part of that network, but were known to us, particularly in Appalachian, Ohio, because of history with the Ohio Community Computing Network. So various pieces of history came together in this assembly. The main thing that we needed to do was develop a model and talk through with each of these partners at great length what it was we proposed to do, whether that was something they were interested in doing, what the likely requirements were going to be for them to do it in terms of federal compliance and reporting, and basically just organizing buy-in. So it was not a selection process, it was a organizing process. And at each point of this, and basically, as I say, it went on for about 4 months, there were organizations, for example, in the Night Network, who just kind of said, well, I don't think that's our cup of tea, right? So we ended up with this group through a process of negotiation and winnowing. And actually, there was a further process. I want to get into this, but once we actually had been competitively approved for a large grant, we still had to go through a negotiation process about the project with NTIA. And that was a point at which they basically said, we're not interested in that particular partner, which was a very hard discussion with those partners, let me tell you, right? And, but we do, you're welcome to bring in somebody else who can do it for half that much money. And so we ended up with some last minute recruitment at the end of that process. Overall, this was the furthest thing from we have the money and apply for it. It was the exact opposite. It was, would you like to do this? The thing that I want to stress about that process is that it was really, really important for it to be transparent from the get, right? We could not have built the kind of trust that made it possible in the long run to do the project if everybody hadn't gotten into the habit, right, of talking the whole thing through completely transparently. And the other thing I'd like to make sense, and I want to drop this particular aspect of the conversation, but if you're thinking about organizing a project and looking for partners, that's one thing. Then you have a selection process in a sense. I think it's really important for many people, my guess is many people on the call, to be thinking about this in terms of, would I want to be a partner in such a project for my community, right? And that's at least as important for people to be aware of. And there are a couple of very important things to remember. One is the fact that you are a subsidiary partner in a federal grant program does not relieve you of compliance reporting, right? Performance obligations, right? A federal Federally funded partnership is a succession of contractual relationships, right? And each contracting partner has to be a federally qualified contract provider, right? Which means you've got to through the process of setting up to do that, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But more important, your organization has to be prepared to do it, right? You probably need counsel, right? So you certainly need the ability to sign MOUs and contracts. So that means you don't want to get yourself into this unless you really want to do it, right? And the second thing is you want to make sure, because the money will come and the money will go. You want to make sure at the other end of that you have built something that you want to build for your community. And to me, those are the two most important things for people who are, I don't know, if we use this hub and spoke territory. If you're going to be a spoke, not a hub, right? You got to think as carefully about those relationships. So that's all I really want to say about that, except that I hope that we get to talk about some more of the details of those as we go on.
Bill, thank you. Maggie, to sort of zero in one of the points Bill brought up, how important it was for him to be completely transparent about the process, what it would mean to participate in that partnership, particularly around what the likely requirements will be. So we know that in federal grants, there can be a lot of different requirements. It could be, statutory requirements, right? So like what's actually in the law that established the grant program. There are requirements that the agency administering the grant develops. But there's also just general regulations governing grants, any grants issued by the U.S. government. Notably the Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations. So those regulations, require organizations or entities applying for grants, including the subawardees, as Bill mentioned, to make certain certifications and to commit to maintaining compliance throughout the grant period. Can you talk to us about how you guided your partners through that process in terms of communicating to them what those were, make sure they understood it well?
Sure, happy to. And I also just want to express appreciation and sort of double click on Bill's point about trust and transparency, because I think that is such a bedrock of all of this work together, and it's really hard to do. And so I think both, funding these networks and being part of these networks requires really leaning into those difficult conversations together. I'm just going to quickly share the slide where we were kind of reflecting on, what are those intermediary organizations that we were looking for in the Regional and Tribal Partners Program, and then I'll back up and talk a little bit about some of those federal grant requirements. So we were looking obviously for partners who were already in a position, already had sort of an existing broad range of relationships in their regions. The 13 regional and tribal partners are councils of governments. There are a couple of nonprofit organizations with aligned missions in there. And then there are both planning commissions and economic development commissions or corporations. And so we sort of got a variety of organizations, but the key thing we were looking for is what's their ability to convene folks together, and how much experience have they had with this kind of relationship building and being able to sort of bring a broad range of partners along with them, and just the ability to convene, which people always underestimate, but to have successful convenings with your partners is such a critical part of this work. And again, as Bill mentioned, that sort of hub organization having the capacity, the ability to sort of quickly ramp up, what does the staffing scenario look like? What's their communications infrastructure, their ability to do the reporting and keep track of everybody else's reporting. And then we just really needed them to be, communicative and transparent with us. It'd be sort of the eyes and ears in these different geographic regions in the state, but also into the particular barriers and challenges and opportunities that we could see with the covered populations. Because as a new quasi-governmental entity in Maine, it's not as though we at MCA had relationships with the people that really needed to be engaged in the process. So that was all critically important as we thought about identifying who these kind of hub organizations would be for us. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to another program that we're working on called the Connectivity Hubs Grant Program. This is funded by Capital Projects Fund under Treasury regulations. This has been a significant learning process for us as a state on sort of figuring out how you can fund less well-resourced organizations that are closer to those covered populations within the kind of rigorous requirements of federal funding, which has been really challenging. So there are a few things that we have done with the Connectivity Hubs program, and there are things that we are now in the process of designing for moving forward with our capacity funding. So I'll just mention some of those. With the Connectivity Hubs program, you'll see sort of halfway down in the page some of those specific resources that we put together. We did release a draft contract when we opened the application for the program, which was really helpful to get people thinking about like what is going to be required under this contract. And I think seeing it on paper was really important at that early stage of the program. We also did a specific webinar to just talk through some of those requirements of the statute you mentioned, Sion, like the procurement policies, what it means for the federal government to have a federal interest in your building, what the performance period means, what those requirements for reporting would be in the long term. And I think one of the things that we've learned through this Connectivity Hubs program is that sometimes even just like providing some of this information and technical assistance actually just discourages people from applying, which, you know, as a state agency and as a funder, I have mixed feelings about that, right? Like I don't want to put under-resourced organizations in a position of managing federal funds that will have an impact on them organizationally in a negative way. But at the same time, those are organizations I really need to be part of this work. So some of the things we're thinking about as we move forward are developing templates that our partners can use. You know, what does it look like to describe a sole source relationship, for example, that could be a paper trail for your procurement processes? What does a sample MOU look like with your partner? And a number of other sort of templates and pieces of this work. The other thing I would say in terms of sort of helping organizations through this process is that we need the sort of webinars and the group conversation. So we really think of our grantees as a cohort together so they can problem solve with one another in addition to with us as a funder. But the one-on-one time is really important for helping navigate folks through federal regulations. And in our state, we're talking with other state agencies. We're talking with our Maine Association of Nonprofits about creating sort of an educational, a suite of educational resources to help organizations navigate these federal funding opportunities. I think it's a significant challenge. So I don't know if you see I could go on and on about federal regulations and some of those challenges, but I hope that gives us a good starting place.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing and dropping that link in the chat. Before we get further, we're doing awesome on time, by the way. So I wanted to bring it back to you, Bill, if there's anything else that you wanted to touch on in that, you know, the process from the organization of the partners to the grant submission process. Anything else you wanted to zero in on? Or another question that I actually forgot to ask is there anything you would do differently next time?
Okay. Well, first, let me say that I just stuck a link to a piece of our website, which has a bunch of the historical material about the project I'm describing. So if people are curious about the way it worked, it's all there. Um, I think, well, let me just refer back to a little bit of what Maggie was describing, because I think that I wasn't that specific, and maybe it would be helpful to be. So in the process of organizing the coalition or the consortium that we organized, and what we were organizing people to do was essentially take responsibility for little groups of staffers for whom they would receive money and then would have responsibility for hiring, for managing, and for producing results with, as well as additional money for, put in new computer labs, right? There was actually a little chunk of funding that went to everybody to, they had discretion to use it for individual assistance for participants to get a computer or get a connectivity arrangement. So all in all, each of the teams of 5 that were kind of the units of this funding, so-called CYC core groups, came with an obligation for about 1,800 folks helped, and think about $1 million, right? And so that was kind of the distribution, right? That was the basis of the contract. So the way that we worked that all out was, frankly, a bunch of exchanges of budgets, one-to-one, with the organizations. Here's what we're thinking about. What would that cost you to do, right? And then we ended up with this detailed MOU, over which we had 2 webinars and essentially negotiation sessions describing it. So that was kind of our version of the process that she was describing. And then the actual proposal writing was done by one community with a couple of professional proposal writers helping, and with Angela Siefer working on it, and with various other people working on it, right? So that if it was a very labor intensive process, right? And so I think it's important for people not to underestimate what it's going to take to do all that, right? That's my bottom line. The other thing is, I guess I'd like to refer to on the what would I do differently subject. I think we did the project itself very, very well, right? I mean, I'm very proud of it, frankly, because I think we really produced on it. Probably the other, we were among the biggest BTOP projects, and one of the other biggest BTOP projects was Tech Goes Home in Massachusetts. And we had different models, but we're very much collegial, right? Talk to each other a lot, right? When we finished, we were done. We were on the street, right? When Tech Goes Home finished, within a year or so, they had $1 million a year commitment from the city of Boston to continue their program, right? That's because they did their program in a way which built in a partnership in which the city was and the school district were very, very strong partners. And we did not have that kind of partnership, Bill. Wasn't what we were after, and we didn't have it. I think it's really, really important for people to think about where the money will end up, where you will end up as a result of spending the money successfully. I would say that, I mean, in fact, I do say to people in Cleveland, if you want to see a successful project that has legs, go talk. Don't look at ours. Look at Tech Goes Home, because it's still here, right? So, and in the long run, even though they did less production during the same time than we did, over the course of the ensuing 10 years, they've done a great deal more, right? So that's, I guess that's the bottom line. Is I would go back and ask, not from the point of view of one community, the central group, but from the point of view of each of the local groups in Cleveland and Detroit and elsewhere, how is this thing going to build your community framework to do this after this whole project is done? And of course, there were people who did take advantage of it to go ahead and do work in their communities. I mean, you can talk to Wanda Davis at Ashbury to see one very good example of that. But that is the question I would ask. And I don't think we could have done Tech Goes Home in Cleveland. Boston is a different place, right? But that's the question that we should have been asking. And if there's anything I would do differently, it would be to ask that question more effectively.
Bill, thank you. Maggie, I know it sounds like you may have incorporated some of your lessons learned into what you're doing now, but is there anything you wanted to add to that about what you might, how you might approach this process differently?
I almost want to just, every time Bill talks, I want to say, yes, what he just said. But we've seen a sort of broad range of different types of partnerships and work emerge through the Regional and Tribal Broadband Partners Program. And there are sort of two models that we're seeing. One is very similar and consistent with what Bill was describing with Tech Goes Home, where we have a rural region where the regional partner early on said, the best way for this work to be sustainable and for us to be effective is to identify our adult education partner that has a long history and lots of reach within our region. And that's how we're going to be successful. And so that in that particular region, that's the magic, is the partnership between the adult education program, where they shared funding to create new positions at adult ed through the regional partner. And then they loop in all of the rural libraries to be partners in the process. So that's one model we've seen that's really very much like, what's the sustainable partnership model? And then in some of the other regions, which is very interesting, that didn't provide significant funding for the coalition partners within the network or the spokes for staffing or things like that, they have created sort of light touch, like stipend programs that allow them to integrate the digital inclusion work into existing programs and work. So some of the partners have provided device stipends to their community action programs, for example, so that as the community action program staff are doing eligibility for a variety of other supports with low-income households, they can also identify, does the household have a device? Is there a need? Is there a digital skills need here? And so there's that kind of integration into existing programs that I think ultimately can also lead to sustainability, but looks very different than that sort of equally funding staff at, a partner organization. So I think that one of the benefits of the Regional and Tribal Partners Program that we didn't see in the beginning was the unique approaches that the partners would take, and sort of creating space within the program for those approaches to build momentum and for it to look different depending on who the partners were and what assets they had and what resources they had in place.
Great, thanks, Maggie. Now we're going to shift to talk about some of the exciting outcomes of the grants that you all are awarded. Samantha, I'll kick it off with you. Can you talk about, so you've worked under the grant program with Bill. Can you talk about what you consider to be some of the major achievements under the grant and how you track progress towards the goals, and any tools that you use that were helpful in that effort?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Well, I think it's probably first to note is the BTOP program that Bill and I worked on did have a set of federal reporting guidelines. Clearly there was a lot of financial reporting involved. There were basic metrics around adoption, which was our leading, we call them SBAs, Sustainable Broadband Adopters, which was like the main metric. But there was not a lot of guidance on how that information or that data was collected, and certainly was not a lot of guidance on how it might be validated or audited in the future. I think what we found out is it really wasn't audited in the end. But what we found is that the information that we ended up creating a data collection process around was not only there to serve the point of the program. Obviously, we had to deliver some numbers that we felt comfortable standing on. But they reflected metrics that were important to our partners and what we imagined would be useful to our sustainability efforts downstream. And so I think one thing that makes the Connect Your Community program really unique is the investment in time, resources, and just brute force, I think, in a lot of ways, to create not only a reporting and data collection process, but we actually created an entire platform. At the time, we ended up building it on top of Moodle. I don't know if anyone knows what Moodle is, but it's similar platform. It's like a learning management system. I think a lot more schools in this area use like Blackboard. It was sort of like one of those types of programs for managing educational programs. We ended up altering it quite a bit. At the time, it was an open source platform. We did quite a lot of software development. And by the end of the program, we were able to track participation, volunteer hours, who was training what topics were doing well. And that was really important and critical to a hub and spoke model, because as the hub, we couldn't be in all of our sites, which was spread across 5 states at one time. So we needed a way to use data to help us monitor whether the program was staying on the tracks, whether we were meeting goals, things of that nature, so that we could course correct and respond. So that data collection was not just for reporting, it was for the management of the program. It allowed us to see, oh gosh, we're seeing a lot of attrition here. What's going on? Do more investigation and correct things. Sometimes it was a mismatch of an instructor. Sometimes it was a location that was just wrong. Sometimes the content was off the mark. And so it allowed us to change that kind of midstream and be pretty nimble in our approach to addressing the gaps that would pop up. So we were able to do that. And at the end, we had this great data set that allowed us to track how many hours people came through, what were their driving interests, like their personal trajectories, what brought them to the program, whether that was healthcare, to use Facebook to see their grandkids' pictures, whether it was, for a workforce need or whatnot. We were able to see that in the data. And potentially more importantly, because we had such good participant data and we understood who these people were, we were able to conduct surveys. So we did one at the end of the program. This was maybe, what do you say, Bill, like 6 months out from the program-ish. And that was the first one. And then we did another one of the same group that was 6 years later. And I think, to my knowledge, is one of the first longitudinal studies of broadband adoption programs and how they affected. And essentially what that was allowed us to show is that there's really a huge cascade of value that happens from the impact. So this was a large, major investment, and clearly we trained 33,000 people under the CYC program. But ultimately, 6 years out, the data shows that really those 33,000 people went and often paid it forward and trained friends and family members. And we had a much larger impact long term. So it was on the back of that sort of data that we were able to start pulling in more local leadership. And sort of the rest is history. But at the time, that meant bringing county leadership into our program, or into, not the program, into the cause of digital equity and being a support and partner long-term as they are today.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Some of the highlights of what you shared that stuck out to me was, making sure that you were reflecting metrics that were important to the partners. So more than just like the perfunctory process, maybe of being in compliance with, which is very important. You had an eye toward, being imaginative with what you could do with the data. So
Yes.
Thanks for sharing that. Maggie, I want to turn it over to you. Can you share with us a little bit about what you consider to be sort of the major achievements of the grant program and the partnership, and what was helpful for you in tracking progress throughout?
Sure. And again, I feel like this is sort of a very different thing in that we were not actually funding direct digital inclusion programming. But I think the biggest accomplishment from our regional and tribal broadband partners program is that we were able to create a state digital equity plan that really had robust engagement from every part of the state. And the regional and tribal partners created their own regional plans with their engaged partners, but they also, throughout the process, were able to extend our reach in such a significant way, which included the completion of, I think it was close to 700 individual interviews and interviews with organizational partners, which was clearly not a reach as an agency that we would have been able to have without these partners. And they generated survey responses in all of their regions in a really significant way. Some of the tools that we used, I know it sounds so simple, but one of the things that was incredibly valuable to our success was just having a shared Google Drive and having both our shared folder where we were using common tools throughout the process, and then folders for our individual partners so that they were not needing to always log into the portal, the reporting portal, or email us something. They could simply drop, here's my new budget, or here's this, document that we've been working on, drop it into their individual folder and we would have access to it. So really having shared access that makes things very easy, we thought was important. Some of the tools that we used, that we developed early on with the support actually of National Digital Equity Center, which was a key partner in supporting our regional and tribal partners and the whole planning process. We had a template plan that was based on the state plan, so they could simply drop in each of their requirements based on what they were learning into text boxes, and then we extracted those elements to include in the state plan. We also had a focus group script and a way for them to capture responses from their focus groups in terms of numbers and qualitative information, and even quotes from folks that they were doing focus groups with. And we just had common, presentation tools as well. So we had a slide deck that any of the partners could use for a community meeting, for example. So we weren't tracking data and impact in the same way, but we were able to use some of these common tools to really allow us to extend our reach to all of the geographic areas in the state that needed to be obviously represented in our plan.
That's perfect, Maggie. Thank you. It sounds like you really made sure that people felt like they were participants in this process, and that's really great. We have time for some questions, so I'm going to share, or I'll read some of those aloud. Let me get into the document. Okay, so Bill, I'm going to start with you. And there's a lot of interest, I think, about thinking about what the right cadence is for meeting with the organizations, or how you prioritize which organizations you meet, which partners that you meet with. So I want to ask, were you organizing meetings for the whole group at once, or many smaller discussions with single partners? Can you talk us through that?
Yes. Yes, they were. They were both. I don't want to make this sound too mysterious. In order to have somebody consider, joining a project, obviously you've got to have a conversation with them and you've got to give them some paperwork, right? And they've got to go back and talk to their board, right? Or talk to their director, and maybe they have to talk to a lawyer. So you want to give people as much material as is going to be necessary for them to make those decisions. And then at some point you've got to socialize that. Okay, they're in the discussion, they've agreed to be in that. Now we have to have a discussion with other partners. It actually, the sequence of things in our project was a little more complicated, because the way that we structured it was to have a local lead agency, and then in a couple of cases have folks who were doing contracts with them, right? So we had 6 partners led by the Cleveland Housing Network in Cleveland. We had 3 partners led by a big community education organization in Detroit. Those, obviously there were multiple layers of discussion going on there, lots of relationships to work out. And then in other cases, it was just between us and one local partner. And that was true in I think 5 places. So, we just did what we had to do. The main thing was that at some point there had to be a common instrument that everybody signed off on. And that was a, standard MOU, which actually had a lot of stuff in it, including a description of the project and the project kind of protocols. That was not the ultimate contract. That was just the MOU for purposes of doing the application. And I don't think that there were a lot of phone calls with directors as well. So it was a time-consuming process because we had a lot of organizations involved. But the main thing was that no question ever got left unanswered. No discussion that anybody wanted to have ever didn't get scheduled, right? Because it was the main thing we were doing for 3 months. And that may actually be the main point I'd make is, again, if you want to create, you're going to organize this thing, you got to be able to take the time to organize it. That's actually a job. And that may or may not be a job that you have anybody funded to do. So consider that. So at every stage along the way, there will be work to do that may or may not fit into project funding. So including for all your partners, all of whom and all of our partners invested a lot of time that they could all have lost, right? It could have, now that's development. Everybody has to do it, but that's really what the process was. I hope that's a useful answer to the question. It's not formulaic in this case. It was the formula was do what you got to do to make sure everybody's happy.
I think the useful point is just to say start now. Like if you're thinking that you might do this and we're expecting the NOFO to come out late summer, or early fall, that would mean that your 3-month time window is basically right now. So start having conversations.
Yeah, and I was smiling when Sam posted that in the chat. I think that is so important. And I would also say that as you're having those conversations, keep your state broadband offices, and particularly your digital equity staff, informed, because obviously the states have such significant interest in seeing work in our states and in our regions to be supported to help complement what the state capacity funds can cover. I wanted to be sure to just make a particular point that with all of the unknowns between these funding sources, with the states rolling out their capacity funds, not knowing what can be funded in the competitive program, with tribes having the opportunity to apply for capacity funding directly, but also apply for the competitive program and be eligible for state capacity funds. It's just so important that we're all communicating so that we don't have things not get funded because there was duplication of activities within various applications going to different funding streams. So just, I know that we're benefiting so much in Maine from the transparency that our partners have with us and with one another about what they're looking at for funding opportunities, and how we can sort of coordinate to make sure that a lot of great work is funded overall in our state.
Yeah, actually, Sian, if I could just, I want to go back to something I said casually, but maybe I should make a more serious point about it. What we were doing in 2009 was very, very speculative, right?
Oh, yeah.
The whole process this time is not so speculative. It is obviously speculative that, in a competitive grant process, winning is speculative, right? But it isn't at all unreasonable for local organizations, for example, to go to a local funder and say, we want to put together a competitive grant process that could bring the community several $1 million. Could you give us $10,000 to support the process of developing this proposal? Obviously, to do that, there has to be somebody who's been legitimated to be the recipient and do the work and lead the work. But it will cost you money to raise this money, right? And it probably is not unreasonable, depending on the, sort of resources of the community, of your funding community, right? To look around for places to pay for that process. Professionalizing the development. If you haven't ever confronted the federal application process, take my word for it. You're going to spend a lot more time on this than you thought. And so you should not lowball that if you can avoid it, because it's going to take a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. Just to pick out what you just said, Bill, when you said speculative,
Yeah.
Back in 2009, when you were, standing the program up, it wasn't a given across audiences that investment in sustainable broadband adoption was going to create, vast societal benefit. That was a question that was looking to be answered. Today, I think we have much more agreement on the fact that this is, in fact, a worthwhile endeavor. And so it's less about trying to prove the point of adoption, but to think about where its place is in our societal fabric long term. And I do think that the goal of that we're approaching today is different than the one we were approaching in 2009 for that reason.
Thanks, Bill and Samantha. Samantha, I have a little more detailed question for you about the data collection. Can you tell us about how granular the data is about the individuals, like the families and friends?
Sure. So there's a couple different things. If you're talking about the data we collected as part of the program, we had a intake process, which basically it was name, contact information, basic information there, but also a series of demographic questions that mapped to the U.S. Census data. So we asked, the age, race, that sort of thing, to understand, what populations we were addressing. We also asked a series of computer ownership and adoption questions. So to ask people to self-identify their level of literacy when they came in, and that was asked again at their exit of the program. So roughly, we had all of that information when people came into the program. Now, once people came into the program, we were doing training predominantly. That was like the predominant activity of the CYC program. And so we understood which classes they were enrolled in, how many instances of that class was happening. So like, one class was typically a 30-hour track. So there was multiple sessions of the class. We tracked attendance at those classes. So we knew, who when they showed up, when they didn't show up. We certainly were scanning regularly for, multiple missed classes or absences to track for attrition, which would trigger outreach activities, things of that nature. At the end, when we started doing survey, we used the contact information that we collected as part of the intake process to recontact people via phone predominantly, and ask them a series of questions that I posted some links to the reports, and you can read more about those questions there, but basically about their use of technology post-program. Bill, anything to add on that?
Well, only that none of the personal information was shared with anybody except for the agencies, except for the program. This is all treated as completely confidential, internal to the walls. And we did have, as you can imagine, every organization had discussions with people coming in about the reason for collecting this stuff. There were libraries, I will say, that made decisions not to participate in the process because they could not do what I'm describing. This was actually an issue. But it obviously, we felt that it was important to be able to know what was going on, right? We were going to have one crack at it.
Mhm.
And I think we got very, very little resistance
I would
to
agree.
the data collection. But we also were, we were quite serious that this was never going to leave the walls. So only aggregated data was ever shared with the feds or with anybody.
Correct. Yeah, I think we assumed there's a lot more anxiety about us collecting it than was proven in the field when we actually asked for phone numbers and names. Most people were willing to give it to us in the context of this is how they engage.
Yeah, and we might call you back to ask about results. We were
Yeah, we were very
we
clear.
tried to be
upfront.
careful about telling people what it was that might happen with this.
That's correct.
Thank you both for that awesomely thorough answer. Next, someone has a question about, and this is, for anyone, just reflecting on your experience. Might you have any recommendations for national organizations that have programs in multiple states? So how might they think about their approach to organizing partners and thinking through the feasibility and how they might structure, lead entities and sub-grantees?
Can you reword that a bit, Cyan?
Yeah, I think they're just trying to get a sense of, how they might pursue a grant opportunity like the competitive grant process. They have they have a wide dispersions of programs in multiple states. Is there any unique consideration you think that would be helpful for them to think through?
I think that with Bill, you can talk about, CYC, because you mentioned this early. You didn't approach too many organizations that were strangers. You had some connection to them, whether it was a previous working relationship or another connection through the Knight Foundation or something like that. It's not like you were cold calling partners in other states to participate, right?
No, not at all. This was a discussion among people within networks. But I'm not sure whether the question is about how do we best leverage our existing partners that are national, or whether it's somehow gathering new partners.
I think the thinking about this question is leveraging existing partners. Right?
Yeah. Okay. So then I would say it's the same discussion. Another way to look at this: what is the self-interest of each of these partners in participating in this program? Right.
Mhm.
And you have a self-interest. Obviously, you're thinking about it. You just need to talk to potential participants about their interest and self-interest. But I think it's important to do it because you can't assume that you know, right? You can't assume, even if people say, oh, sure, we'd be interested, what that actually means if you haven't talked about very specific things, including budget. So I guess everything I said about doing the work is you just got to get on the phone and have
Talk to your friends.
have conversations with people. Yeah, I mean, it sounds simplistic, but that's actually what happens.
So we actually have a few of these questions I directed at you specifically. So one very, very sort of candid, straightforward question is, why did you and your organization want to take on such a big coordinating role?
Well, the most direct answer is that we were engaged with Knight, and by the organization, I mean one community now, right? We had a partnership with Knight. The purpose of our partnership with Knight was to help local organizations in the cities they were interested in to prepare themselves better, strategically and otherwise, to raise funds to do digital, anti-digital divide work, right? So this was a possible answer to that question, right? So that's where it actually came from in the discussions with people in Akron and Detroit, right? And then in some other Knight cities. In addition to which, our network in Cleveland had exactly the same, was not part of the Knight network, was very interested in the same question. So those were the common interests that led us to say, here's a way for us to address all these things simultaneously. That's why. But the flip side of this is, had that relationship not existed, I don't think one community would have taken this on, right? And the evidence for that is the second after there was no more federal money, they were not interested anymore, right? I don't know how to be more blunt or truthful about this, right? And honestly, I don't blame them because it wasn't their core mission, right? But it very much was an answer to a question for the commitment they'd made to the Knight Foundation. So that's what actually led us to it in the first place. I think many of us personally would have been trying to figure out how to do this in order to, serve our local work. This happened to be a good arrangement to do it, right? We certainly didn't know it was going to be a good arrangement when we started. It just turned out to be.
Thank you. I have another question here that is getting us back to the point of long-term sustainability. To summarize it, how should people think about funding staff positions beyond the initial grant funding? So the question was, it would be interesting to gain insight on the staffing and funding for these programs that seem to be extended for a long time, and what their funding sources were, whether it was state or other possibly philanthropic support. So how should people think about keeping these staff positions funded beyond the initial grant funding?
I would say there's a lot of different models for this, and it really depends on your local environment. And Maggie and Bill, by all means, jump in. But I think we have followed quite a bit of the logic of the meaningful uses of internet adoption. If the purpose of the project is to increase internet use and adoption, there are people that benefit from that activity, that increase in activity. And those are pretty wide ranging. They can be workforce benefits, educational benefits, healthcare benefits. And so those stakeholders are benefiting from the value of the effort. And so could be, depending on your relationships and your local political environment, and partnerships, of course, but they could be a pathway to sustainable funding of an effort long term, should you be able to quantify those impacts and values for them? So if, and I'm just going to make it up for a wild story here, but if you trained 1,000 people to use a local electronic health portal record, and that resulted in a benefit to the local safety net hospital, it's conceivable that that hospital might contribute through their philanthropic arm some level of support to continue sustaining that benefit that they are able to realize. So it's about making sure where your partnerships in, making sure you have members of these stakeholder organizations at the table when you're designing your program, and talking frankly about what does it mean to sustain a program. Clearly, one-time infusions will help stand something up. Usually there is an upfront cost to that sustaining it might be a bit lower, than the initial investment. So, but what would that be, and what would it take, and how can you prove the impact to be of value in alignment to other stakeholder self-interests in your region?
Samantha, thank
I
you.
think that's exactly right. The meaningful use issue is so important because this is the sort of model that all of the states have taken in their digital equity planning and working with the NTIA, which is aligning our digital equity goals and work with other existing state goals. So for us, it's, our economic development and workforce goals, our educational attainment goals, our ability to support people in healthy aging and aging at home, and removing barriers for telehealth and being able to expand telehealth programs. So all of the states have those sort of meaningful use goals in alignment with this work. The other piece that we've been really thinking about is the enabling function that digital inclusion has, and that sort of case to be made to our philanthropic partners who are particularly interested in either a particular issue like education or healthcare, or a particular population. And when we think about making the case to our philanthropy partners, I think it's a lot about how this digital inclusion work is enabling greater success with those interest areas that they're already funding, and that there are likely ways to integrate this work into their philanthropic work.
Just make a note, I also posted a link to a report earlier called Connecting Cuyahoga, which goes through a very, very granular step-by-step. It's a long report. It's very detailed, but it talks about the return on investment for connecting digital training with social service delivery. And it actually shows for initial investments that long-term brings actual, not just savings, but it actually generates more money than it would need to eat to stay alive, to sustain that program. So, you can take a look. It's just one potential example of this kind of meaningful use application.
Yeah. I mean, I would add that our experience happened 6 years before, concluded 7 years before COVID hit. And the world is different. We all know that. So while I don't think there's necessarily any reason to believe there's going to be another round of big federal money that follows this one, I mean, who knows, right? That doesn't mean that the environment in your community hasn't changed. It doesn't mean the environment in your state hasn't changed, right? The state of Ohio has a broadband office that is quite dedicated to supporting this work, right? So that's a whole new thing, right? The Cleveland Foundation is quite dedicated to supporting this work. It didn't used to be, right? So these are changes, and obviously, as with, I mean, everybody on the call is tracking those changes in your own community. The reason I pointed to Tech Goes Home as an example of a very successful example of this is that I think way ahead of others, they did succeed. Well, I mean, their project was designed by a middle school principal, right? They were embedded in the school system, And the reason the city ended up supporting the extension of the program was in order to support the schools, right? So it was pure and simple. It was delivering results for the school system.
They
That was
leverage significant volunteer hours from school teachers as well in that model.
well, yeah. It was a school system program essentially, and we started doing work in CYC around personal health record training, among the first places I think in the country that started doing that. That was really a reflection of, hey, we ought to be able to get the hospitals involved in this. It took a long time, but the hospitals in Cleveland and other places are now involved in it, right? So it's, environments do change over time, but I think this environment has many, many more real opportunities than anything we were talking about then. So you just got to get aligned with them. That's all.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We have another question here that I know that we might have touched on briefly, but I think a good way to think about it is to think about it from the perspective of somebody of an organization that maybe isn't hyper tapped into the digital inclusion network, or has a strong intuition of what the ecosystem looks like in their state. How should a potential partner find and engage with other potential applicants? What's the top line advice you might give them?
Maggie, that's what you're doing, right?
I would say, go to Net Inclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that particularly for our regional and tribal partners, they were doing this from scratch, right? Like they were creating digital equity coalitions from nothing within their regions. And it was really just a process of reaching out to partners that they thought would likely be already doing some of this work, like their libraries, their adult education, their schools, and partners that were really close to those covered populations. So I think there's a starting place because of the covered populations and the type of work that we're doing. But I think that Net Inclusion is, the place where we're finding so many of our partners. All of the states are holding similar types of statewide events. In many cases where national and regional partners are also attending. And so just getting a sense of where those events are happening in places that you're interested in doing work, I think is also a good starting place. I know I will say here, our annual digital equity workshop, in which the second annual is coming up on May 22nd, is just a critical part of our work where all of these partners are coming together. And that same thing is happening in other states all over the country because of this sort of moment we're in, this opportunity we have. I also think cold calling is completely legitimate and a good starting place that leads you, to the next place in the next conversation.
Thank you, Maggie, for saying NDIA, right? That's why NDIA was invented, right? So it's what all these guys are doing, right? So people may not know this, but we actually, one of the things we did in our project was hold a national conference for folks who were doing BTOP funded projects in Cleveland about 2 years in. And the person who ran that conference was Angela Seifer. It was kind of a dry run for the first NDIA conference, which happened 3 years later. So there is a development process here happening. And the reason why we thought that would be useful is because everybody wanted to talk to each other. And the reason we thought NDIA would be useful is that everybody still wanted to talk to each other because they were trying to figure out what to do about getting their next round of funding. And now everybody's trying to talk to each other about how to take advantage of the funding that's there. So there's always plenty to talk about.
I always refer back to the project director and manager calls during BTOP, where we talk to other program leadership across the country. And at the time, this is before Zoom, before video calls, so they're literally on a phone. But people really leaned into those calls and they were extremely transparent with each other about what was going on in their programs. There was a ton of peer sharing, and I don't always see that in places, in current projects. And so I would really encourage, I think, everyone to think about how can you be a peer mentor for other people thinking about these projects. Because I think each of us on this call, each of us watching this webinar have some value to add and a perspective that's valuable on the work that needs to be done in our communities. And we're only going to be able to catalyze that value and knowledge if we talk to each other and are not, afraid or guarded, or I don't want to look weak or this and that, because we're all grappling with the same things. So just, putting that out there, because I think that was one of the unsung heroes of the BTOP era, were those calls.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Sam. And I think that the extent to which we go into these partnerships and this work together with the learning mindset that some parts of this are not going to work. Sometimes our partnerships are going to be strained, and we have to set a culture at the very beginning that says, in 3 months, we're going to check in with each other about how we're really doing and what's working and what's not, and create space for that in a very deliberate way. And I know for us in the Regional and Tribal Partners Program, there's so much that we learned in year 1 that has informed the way that we've changed in year 2, and even moments in year 1 where we just pivoted completely from one thing to the next thing. And you have to be able to share those things that are not going well. And not only to pivot, but also because it is such the core of the trust that you build.
And you never know who's going to have a good response to solving that problem. That is one of the great things about NDIA. They've created a really uniquely safe space for discussion amongst practitioners. I think we're going to need to have a lot more of those spaces moving forward during capacity and competitive DE projects.
Thank you all. It's been wonderful hearing about your experiences. Thank you to our panelists for participating. We really appreciate you. We're close to being at time, so I'm going to hold off. We had just like a couple more questions, I think. And if we can come up with an answer to those, that's actually something that we can send out in a I'll figure out how we can maybe share any last details we didn't get to. But thank you all for attending. I want to encourage you, if you're not already an affiliate, if you're not already connected to NDIA, to please join our community. So if you heard about this webinar at the last minute from somebody else, this is a good way to make sure that you learn about it straight from us as we share more information about these federal grant opportunities as that information becomes available to us. You'll be able to participate in monthly community calls and get access to our newsletter as well. So consider joining our community. We will send out an email, like I mentioned, with a link to the recording and relevant links that were shared in the chat as well. So not to worry if you missed some of them. Thank you all and have a really great afternoon.
Thanks for having us.